Somewhere in the folds of ancient memory, before cities rose and empires marched, there was a river. It wasn't the Nile with its floods and pharaohs, nor the Euphrates lined with ziggurats and clay tablets. It was quieter, more modest, but its name would one day echo through the chronicles of Western history. The river was the Tiber, and beside it there was a hill. One hill became 2, then 3, and in time 7. From these 7 hills, not especially tall, not especially grand, would rise a city, and from that city, a world. This story begins not with armies or emperors, but with a legend, one of wolves, brothers, and the uncertain boundary between myth and memory. The Romans, like many ancient peoples, liked to explain their beginnings through story. Stories that weren't always true, but were always important. They told of a woman named Rhea Silvia, a Vestal virgin, and of Mars, the god of war. From their union, divine or profane, came twin boys, Romulus and Remus. The king at the time, fearing prophecy and bloodlines, ordered the children to be drowned in the Tiber. But fate, or perhaps fiction, had other plans. The basket holding the twins washed ashore, caught in the roots of a fig tree. There they were discovered, not by farmers or priests, but, as the tale goes, by a she-wolf. She suckled them in a cave, the Lupercal, until a shepherd named Faustulus took them in and raised them as his own. The brothers grew strong, bold, restless. In time they learned who they were, not just orphans but princes, and so they set out to build a city of their own. But they could not agree. Remus favored the Aventine Hill, Romulus the Palatine. They argued, perhaps about omens, perhaps about ambition. The result was blood. Romulus killed his brother, and so the city was founded. Its name, Rome. It's a difficult beginning, violent, fraternal, strange. But Rome would never be a gentle place. The year was, by Roman tradition, 753 BCE. Of course, the date is debated, and the story, likely invented. But it mattered to the Romans. It gave them a sense of destiny, a beginning wrapped in mystery and might. Romulus became the first king of Rome. He established its first institutions, the Senate, drawn from the elders of noble families, the legions, formed from local men, and religious rites drawn from both Latin and Sabine tradition. He ruled for nearly 4 decades, until, as the stories say, he disappeared in a storm, or perhaps ascended into the heavens. After him came 6 more kings, each with his own shape, his own story. The second king, Numa Pompilius, was a Sabine, a man of peace and ritual. He was said to have been chosen reluctantly, and to have declined the crown until divine signs persuaded him. Numa's reign was one of order, not war. He built temples, codified religious practices, and introduced the Roman calendar. He claimed to be guided by a divine nymph, Egeria, who whispered sacred wisdom in the groves near Rome. Whether true or not, the Romans believed him, and belief was enough. The third king, Tullus Hostilius, reversed Numa's legacy. He was a warrior, a man who brought Rome into conflict with its neighbors. Most famously, he led the war against Alba Longa, another Latin city, and staged the legendary duel between the Horatii and Curiatii, sets of triplet brothers fighting to settle the fate of their cities in single combat. Tullus, though victorious, died, as the story goes, when he neglected religious rites and was struck down by Jupiter's wrath. The fourth king, Ancus Marcius, was said to be the grandson of Numa, and he sought a balance between war and religion. He extended Roman territory to the coast, securing access to salt and trade, and founded the port of Ostia, a move that would shape Roman power for centuries. Next came Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, often called Tarquin the Elder. He was Etruscan, a people from the north whose culture influenced early Rome in architecture, religion, and royal ceremony. Tarquinius expanded the Senate, initiated massive building projects, and introduced games and processions, early forms of what would become the Roman circus. But his rise was not without intrigue. He secured the throne through manipulation, and his rule, while effective, bred resentment. After him came Servius Tullius, perhaps the most mysterious of the kings. Servius, legend says, was born a slave, his head once seen surrounded by flames as he slept, a sign of future greatness. He introduced the census, a revolutionary act that allowed citizens to be ranked by wealth and duty, organizing the military and taxation system. He also restructured Roman society, dividing the people into classes and tribes, a system that would survive for centuries. Yet his end was violent. He was assassinated, thrown down the palace steps by his successor and son-in-law, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, the seventh and final king. Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, ruled not by law but by force. He eliminated rivals, ruled without the Senate, and filled Rome with fear. His son, Sextus Tarquinius, committed a crime so vile, the assault of Lucretia, a noblewoman, that it sparked outrage throughout the city. Lucretia's death became a rallying cry. Her kinsman, Lucius Junius Brutus, led a revolt. The monarchy was abolished, and in its place, the Romans created something new, something unstable, experimental, yet remarkably durable. They called it the res publica, the public thing, the republic. It was a government without a king, a system of elected magistrates, checks and balances, and a senate that held power in trust for the people. It wasn't perfect, it was never meant to be, but it was Rome's answer to tyranny, an attempt to rule themselves, and to never kneel again before a single man. For nearly 5 centuries, the Roman Republic would expand, adapt, and survive, through crisis and conquest, civil war and reform. But before we reach that part of the story, before consuls and censors, tribunes and generals, we must pause, because what came before was not just prologue, it was foundation. Rome's kings, half legend, half leaders, shaped a city that would one day shape the world. The myths they left behind were not distractions, they were identity, and every brick laid under their reigns became part of something that would outlast them all. With the fall of the monarchy, Rome stepped into the unknown. There was no model to follow, no clear design for what came next. The kings were gone, but the city still needed leadership. So the Romans, practical as ever, invented something entirely new. They called it the Republic. The word itself, res publica, meant the public thing, a state belonging to the people, not to a single man. But it was not a democracy in the modern sense. Power still lay in the hands of the aristocracy, the patricians, a narrow class of noble families who claimed descent from the original senators appointed by Romulus. Instead of a king, Rome would now be led by 2 consuls. These were magistrates elected annually by the people, and they would share power equally, each holding the right to veto the other's decisions. This system was designed with intention, to prevent tyranny, to limit ambition, and to ensure that no one man could ever again rule Rome alone. But the early republic was fragile. The removal of the kings had left a power vacuum. Internally, class divisions began to deepen. Externally, neighboring tribes saw Rome's transition as weakness and prepared for war. One of the first great challenges came from the Etruscans. The deposed king, Tarquinius Superbus, did not accept his exile. He fled north, seeking help from other Etruscan cities, including Clusium and Veii. With their backing, he attempted to reclaim the throne through military force. At the Battle of Lake Regillus, a name still remembered in Roman tradition, the fledgling republic faced the last threat of royal restoration. Legend says that during the battle, two divine figures appeared, Castor and Pollux, twin gods of Roman and Greek mythology, fighting alongside the Roman cavalry. Whether myth or metaphor, the republic survived. Tarquin never returned. With external threats pushed back, internal tensions began to rise. The early republic was dominated by patricians, and the plebeians, the common citizens, began to resent their exclusion from political power. They fought in Rome's wars, paid taxes, and built its roads, yet they had little say in its laws. This inequality led to what historians call the conflict of the orders, a long, slow struggle between the social classes. The plebeians began by using their leverage. They refused to serve in the military. It was not a rebellion of arms, but of absence. Rome's survival depended on its citizen soldiers, and without the plebeians, the army could not function. In response, the patricians made concessions. One of the first major changes was the creation of the tribune of the plebs, a new office held by plebeians, empowered to protect the people from injustice. The tribunes had a remarkable tool, the power of veto. With a single word, "I forbid," they could block any law or action that threatened the rights of the plebeians. This was revolutionary. For the first time, political power in Rome had a counterweight. The republic was beginning to balance itself, imperfectly but consciously. Another landmark moment came with the 12 Tables. Before them, Roman law had been unwritten, held in memory and in the judgment of patrician magistrates. The plebeians feared this secrecy, believing it allowed the elite to twist the law to their own advantage. So, around 450 BCE, Rome codified its laws and engraved them on bronze tablets, displayed publicly in the Forum. The 12 Tables were simple, often harsh by modern standards, but they marked a turning point. Law was no longer the privilege of the few. It was now visible, fixed, and shared. The republic, still young, was learning to govern not just by power, but by principle. Yet peace was never permanent in Rome. Even as it reformed itself internally, the city continued to face threats from without. The Volsci, the Equi, the Etruscans, and the Latins all clashed with Roman arms. Some of these wars were brief skirmishes, others stretched on for years. But battle by battle, treaty by treaty, Rome expanded. Slowly, then steadily, it came to dominate central Italy. And with each victory, the republic grew not only in size, but in confidence. It developed new institutions. The Senate, once advisory, became the heart of policy and debate. The assemblies, comitia, gave citizens a voice in lawmaking, even if limited. New magistracies appeared, censors, praetors, aediles, each with distinct roles in maintaining the city, its morals, and its order. By the end of the 5th century BCE, Rome was no longer a city-state fighting for survival. It was a regional power, organized, ambitious, and increasingly aware of its own potential. But its foundation remained tense. The patricians still held most offices, the plebeians still pushed for equality. Reform followed protest, and protest followed reform. This friction, between class and class, ambition and restraint, would shape the republic for centuries. And though few in Rome knew it then, the structures they were building, the consuls, the Senate, the laws, would not only outlast them, but influence the future governments of nations they would never live to see. From the ashes of monarchy, Rome had crafted something resilient, something adaptable, something capable of growth. The Republic was no longer just an experiment, it was becoming a tradition. But traditions, like cities, must be tested. And Rome's greatest tests were yet to come. As the Roman Republic grew more stable within, it turned its eyes outward. The Italian peninsula in the 4th century BCE was not yet unified. It was a mosaic of peoples, Latin tribes, Etruscan cities, Greek colonies, and hill-dwelling warriors with no kings, but fierce traditions. Among these, the Samnites stood out. They lived in the rugged highlands of central Italy, in a region the Romans called Samnium. The Samnites were a confederation of tribes, independent, proud, and accustomed to war. They were not farmers like the Latins. They were herders, mountain fighters. Their armies favored flexibility, and their warriors moved through hills and valleys with ease. Rome's expansion inevitably brought it into conflict with them. What followed would be a series of brutal, drawn-out wars, 3 in total, known to history as the Samnite Wars. The First Samnite War began around 343 BCE. At first, Rome intervened in a local dispute, as it often did, to protect one of its allies, the city of Capua, threatened by Samnite aggression. The campaign was short and indecisive. Rome won a few early victories, but both sides soon agreed to peace. The war ended, but the rivalry had only begun. The real struggle came with the Second Samnite War, beginning in 326 BCE. This was not a skirmish. It was a prolonged, brutal conflict that would last more than 20 years. The Samnites knew the terrain better. They used ambushes and retreats, refusing to fight by Roman rules. And in 321 BCE, they delivered one of the worst humiliations Rome would ever suffer. Near the mountain pass of Caudine Forks, a Roman army was trapped. With no way to escape, the commanders surrendered. The Samnite leader, Gaius Pontius, forced the Romans to pass under a symbolic yoke, a gesture of defeat and disgrace. Rome was stunned, but it did not forget. The Republic reorganized. It learned. It adapted. Over the next 2 decades, Rome built roads into Samnite territory. It strengthened alliances with Latin cities. It raised fresh legions, trained them better, and refined their tactics. The war dragged on, but the tide began to turn. By 304 BCE, the Samnites sued for peace. Rome had endured the humiliation and emerged stronger. The Third Samnite War erupted not long after, in 298 BCE. This time, it was not just Rome and Samnium. A great coalition formed. Samnites, Etruscans, Umbrians, and even Gallic tribes from the north. It was a moment of danger, perhaps the last real chance to stop Rome's ascent. At the Battle of Sentinum in 295 BCE, the two sides clashed in a massive engagement. Legend says that one Roman consul, Publius Decius Mus, sacrificed himself, charging into enemy lines to fulfill a ritual vow and inspire his troops. Whatever the truth, Rome won the day. By 290 BCE, the Samnites were defeated. They would fight again in minor revolts, but their power was broken. Rome now controlled most of central Italy. But the wars had done more than expand territory. They had transformed Rome itself. To wage these campaigns, Rome had to build roads, supply lines, and fortifications. It began to connect the peninsula with its famous viae, straight roads stretching for miles, cutting through forest and mountain alike. These roads were not built for trade. They were built for armies. Legions could now move quickly, reinforcing allies, punishing rebels, extending Rome's reach far beyond the city walls. In time, trade would follow, then culture, then citizenship. The Roman Republic had learned to fight not just with swords, but with systems. It created a model of alliance, offering defeated cities partial rights, local autonomy, and sometimes Roman citizenship. In return, These allies would supply troops, pay tribute, and stay loyal. It was not generosity, it was strategy. Rome did not conquer by destroying everything it found. It conquered by absorbing, by binding people together, with roads, laws, and mutual interest. The legions became not just Roman, but Italian. Allies marched under the Roman banner, often alongside citizens, and in war after war, the strength of the Republic was no longer just in the city, it was in the network of peoples that now looked to Rome for leadership. The Samnite Wars had taught Rome endurance. They had shown that defeat was not final, that organization could triumph over chaos, and that no enemy, no matter how fierce, could outlast the Republic's resolve. But they had also taught Rome something else. Power could grow, and once it did, it had momentum. There were more cities to protect, more enemies to preempt, more borders to secure, and so Rome kept marching, its eyes turned south, toward the rich cities of Magna Graecia, the Greek colonies that dotted the coastal regions of Italy. One of those cities would call for help, another war would follow, and this time the opponent would not be mountain tribesmen. It would be a Greek king, one with elephants, phalanxes, and dreams of empire. Rome's next trial was coming, and its name was Pyrrhus. In the far south of Italy, near the edge of the Ionian Sea, there stood a city. It was Greek in origin, wealthy from trade, proud in culture, and independent in spirit. Its name was Tarentum. Founded by Spartan colonists, Tarentum had long resisted Rome's influence. It looked not to the Latin north, but across the sea, to the Greek world. But by the early 3rd century BCE, Rome's expansion was impossible to ignore. Latin colonies were appearing closer. Roman roads pushed south. Roman armies no longer stayed in their own territory. In 282 BCE, a Roman fleet entered the Gulf of Tarentum. Whether by accident or design, the ships violated a treaty, one that barred Roman vessels from approaching the city. Tarentum responded with outrage. They attacked the Roman ships, sank several, and humiliated the survivors. It was a clear challenge. War was now inevitable. But Tarentum knew it could not face Rome alone. So it turned east, to Epirus, a kingdom across the Adriatic Sea, ruled by a man whose ambition stretched far beyond his borders. His name was Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus of Epirus was a cousin of Alexander the Great, not by blood, but by temperament. He had studied warfare, dreamed of empire, and believed that greatness was earned through conquest. When Tarentum called, Pyrrhus answered. In 280 BCE, he landed in Italy with 25,000 men and a small herd of something Rome had never seen before, war elephants. To the Romans, they were creatures from another world, armored giants that trampled lines and shattered formations. But Pyrrhus saw them as symbols of superiority, a reminder that he came not from the hills, but from the world of kings. The first major battle took place at Heraclea. Pyrrhus deployed his elephants carefully. The Roman cavalry, unfamiliar with the beasts, panicked. The legions faltered, and Pyrrhus won the day. But it was not the triumph he had hoped for. Rome did not sue for peace. Instead, it raised another army. Pyrrhus was puzzled. In the Greek world, one defeat could end a campaign, but the Romans fought differently. They lost and returned. The next year, the two sides met again at Asculum. Once more, Pyrrhus was victorious, but again, his losses were heavy. His allies were unreliable. His treasury was thinning. After the battle, he is said to have remarked, "Another such victory, and I am undone." It was history's first Pyrrhic victory, a win that costs more than it's worth. Seeking easier ground, Pyrrhus turned his attention to Sicily, where Greek cities were struggling against Carthaginian control. At first, he was welcomed. He drove back the Carthaginians, reclaimed territory, and was offered kingship over the island. But his demands grew harsh. The Sicilian Greeks, once eager for help, began to resent him. Meanwhile, in Italy, Rome was rebuilding, again. Pyrrhus returned, now weary, his forces reduced. In 275 BCE, he faced Rome one last time at the Battle of Beneventum. This time, he lost. Not decisively, not catastrophically, but enough to end the campaign. Pyrrhus returned to Epirus. He would die a few years later, not in glory, but in street fighting, struck by a roof tile thrown by an old woman during a skirmish in Argos. His ambition died with him. For Rome, the Pyrrhic War was a lesson. It had faced a Hellenistic king, trained in the tactics of Alexander, and survived. More than that, it had held its ground. It had absorbed loss, regrouped, and persisted. That persistence, more than tactics or numbers, was becoming Rome's defining strength. The Republic did not collapse when it bled. It reorganized, it retaliated, and it remembered. After Pyrrhus, the Greek cities of southern Italy accepted Roman control. The peninsula was nearly unified. Rome now stood as the dominant power in Italy. But power invites rivals, and across the sea, in North Africa, there was another republic, one with its own armies, its own ambitions, and its own fleet. Its name was Carthage. The stage was set. Rome's next war would not be fought over hills or mountain passes. It would be fought over oceans. By the middle of the 3rd century BCE, Rome had secured the Italian peninsula. From the Po Valley in the north to the Greek cities in the south, Roman law, roads, and legions reached farther than ever before. But across the sea, there was another power, Carthage. A wealthy city-state on the coast of North Africa, Carthage had been founded centuries earlier by Phoenician traders. Its people, seafarers, merchants, and navigators, controlled much of the western Mediterranean. Their ships moved spices, metals, slaves, and grain between Africa, Spain, and the islands of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. Carthage did not build empires the way Rome did. It built trade routes, and it protected those routes with one of the most powerful navies the world had ever seen. But as Rome's influence grew, the two republics, similar in structure, yet utterly different in culture, found themselves staring across a narrowing gulf. The spark came from Sicily. Sicily was rich, not just in farmland, but in strategic location. Sitting at the heart of the Mediterranean, whoever controlled Sicily could watch and control every trade route that passed through. In 264 BCE, a small dispute in the city of Messana dragged both powers into conflict. Rome sent troops. Carthage responded with ships. Neither side backed down, and so began the First Punic War, a struggle that would last 23 years. At the start, Rome had a problem. It had no navy. The legions were unmatched on land, but Rome had never been a maritime power. Carthage, on the other hand, had generations of experience at sea, fleets of fast quinquiremes, and skilled sailors from across its empire. But Rome, as always, learned quickly. According to one account, a Carthaginian ship washed ashore during the early stages of the war. Roman engineers studied it, copied its design, and began building their own fleet. Within months, Rome had constructed hundreds of ships, an astounding effort for a nation that, until then, had relied on allied merchant vessels. But building ships was only the beginning. Sailing them, and winning with them, was another challenge entirely. So Rome did something unexpected. It turned naval warfare into something familiar: infantry combat. Roman engineers designed a device called the corvus, a boarding bridge fitted with spikes. When a Roman ship drew close to an enemy, the corvus would drop down, hook into the enemy deck, and allow Roman soldiers to charge across and fight hand to hand. Sea battles became floating land battles, and for a time it worked. Rome won several key victories. At Mylae in 260 BCE, the consul Gaius Julius defeated a superior Carthaginian fleet thanks to the new boarding tactics. Statues were erected, celebrations held, but the sea was unpredictable. Storms destroyed entire Roman fleets, not once, but several times. Thousands of men drowned. Entire campaigns were lost to weather. Some senators began to question the wisdom of continuing the war, but Rome pressed on. Carthage, meanwhile, struggled with its own challenges. Unlike Rome, which fielded citizen soldiers, Carthage relied heavily on mercenaries, men from Gaul, Iberia, and Numidia, paid to fight but not bound by loyalty. These mercenaries could win battles, but they could also mutiny. The war dragged into its second decade. Battles were won and lost. Fortresses changed hands. Sicily became a battlefield soaked in years of blood. Finally, in 241 BCE, Rome achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of the Agates Islands. A rebuilt Roman fleet, paid for by private citizens and outfitted without state funding, cornered the Carthaginian navy and crushed it. Carthage, exhausted and nearly bankrupt, sued for peace. The terms were harsh. Carthage agreed to leave Sicily, pay a large indemnity, and surrender control of certain sea routes. Rome, for the first time, now possessed territory outside the Italian peninsula. Sicily became Rome's first official province. But the end of the war was not the end of tension. Carthage felt humiliated. Rome, victorious, became more confident, perhaps too confident. And both sides knew that the peace was temporary. There would be another war. But neither side could yet predict how brutal, how devastating, and how personal the next conflict would be. For across the sea, in the growing Carthaginian territories of Spain, a young boy was being taught to hate Rome. His name was Hannibal. Long before he crossed the Alps, before his name haunted Roman nightmares, Hannibal was a boy. He grew up in Carthage, in the shadow of defeat. The First Punic War had left his city scarred, its navy humbled, its treasury drained, and its influence shrinking. Hannibal's father, Hamilcar Barca, had fought in that war. He did not forget it, and he would not allow his son to forget it either. One story, told again and again, begins with an oath. When Hannibal was just 9 years old, Hamilcar brought him to the altar. He placed the boy's hand upon it and made him swear, in the presence of the gods, that he would never be a friend to Rome. It was not merely a vow of vengeance, it was a mission, a shaping of identity. From that moment on, Hannibal was not just a soldier in training, he was a weapon being forged. After the war, Hamilcar led Carthaginian forces to Spain, carving out a new empire to replace what had been lost in Sicily. There, he fought tribes, established cities, and laid the foundation for Carthage's second rise. When Hamilcar died in battle, his son-in-law Hasdrubal took command, and when Hasdrubal was assassinated, the army turned to Hannibal. He was 25. Young, charismatic, and already seasoned in war, Hannibal was beloved by his troops. He spoke their languages, shared their hardships, and led from the front. But his ambition reached beyond Spain. Rome, wary of Carthaginian influence, had signed a treaty. It allowed Carthage to control parts of Spain, but forbade attacks on certain cities. One of those cities was Saguntum, an independent state with close ties to Rome. In 219 BCE, Hannibal laid siege to it. He took Saguntum after 8 months of resistance. Rome protested. Hannibal refused to explain himself. Carthage, trapped between pride and pragmatism, refused to hand him over, and so, once more, war was declared. But Hannibal was not interested in another drawn-out struggle in Spain. He had a different plan, bolder, riskier, and almost unthinkable. He would bring the war to Italy, by land. In 218 BCE, Hannibal led an army of roughly 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and a small number of African war elephants northward, through hostile territory, across rivers, mountains, and into the unknown. He crossed the Pyrenees, passed through Gaul, and approached the one barrier Rome never expected him to breach, the Alps. The Alps were not just tall, they were deadly, snow-covered, narrow, and treacherous, especially in autumn. Local tribes harassed his men, rockslides buried supply trains, cold starved the pack animals, and yet Hannibal pressed on. The crossing took weeks. Thousands died along the way. The elephants, symbols of Carthaginian power, struggled with the cold and cliffs. But some survived, and more importantly, Hannibal survived. When he descended into northern Italy, his army was battered but intact. Rome was shocked. No one had ever invaded Italy by crossing the Alps, and no Roman army was ready to face him there. Hannibal wasted no time. He won early victories at the Ticinus River, then at the Trebia, ambushing Roman forces and using the terrain to his advantage. But these were just preludes. In 217 BCE, Hannibal lured a Roman army into a trap near Lake Trasimene. Using morning fog and careful positioning, he ambushed the Romans as they marched along the lakeside. It was a massacre. Thousands were killed, others drowned in the lake. Rome, reeling, declared a state of emergency. They appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus. Fabius took a new approach. He refused to fight Hannibal head-on. Instead, he shadowed him, cut off supplies, avoided direct confrontation. This earned him the nickname Cunctator, the delayer. Many Romans hated this strategy. It felt cowardly, un-Roman. But Fabius understood something few did. Hannibal wanted battle. He wanted Rome to rush in. The Senate, growing impatient, eventually replaced him, and in 216 BCE, 2 new consuls led a massive Roman force, over 80,000 men, to face Hannibal at a small town called Cannae. It would become one of the most studied battles in history. Hannibal arranged his troops in a crescent formation, weaker in the center, stronger on the flanks. As the Romans advanced, they pressed into the center, believing they were breaking his line. But it was a trap. As the center slowly gave way, the flanks curled inward, surrounding the Roman infantry. Carthaginian cavalry routed the Roman horsemen, then circled behind. The Roman army, the largest ever fielded by the Republic, was encircled. What followed was slaughter. By day's end, over 50,000 Roman soldiers lay dead. It was the worst defeat in Roman history. Cities in the south began defecting to Hannibal. Capua joined him. So did several Greek cities. The Gauls of the north rallied to his side. Hannibal had crushed Rome's armies. Italy was trembling. And yet, he never marched on the city. Why? Some say he lacked siege equipment. Others claim he hoped Rome would negotiate peace, as other cities would have done. But Rome refused. It refused to surrender, refused to negotiate, refused to collapse. Instead, it rebuilt again. It raised new legions, younger men, sometimes even slaves, trained and equipped at breakneck speed. It turned again to Fabius, who resumed his strategy of delay. And slowly, over the next several years, the tide began to turn. Hannibal remained in Italy for more than a decade, but each year he lost allies. His supply lines thinned. Reinforcements from Carthage were slow or absent. Rome, meanwhile, adapted. It took back rebellious cities, punished defectors, and opened new fronts. One of those fronts was Spain, where a young general named Publius Cornelius Scipio began defeating Carthaginian forces. By 206 BCE, Scipio had driven them out of the peninsula entirely. Then, he did something bold. He proposed to take the fight to Africa, to Carthage itself. In 204 BCE, with Senate approval, Scipio landed in North Africa. There, he forged alliances with local tribes, including the Numidians, former allies of Carthage. Under pressure, the Carthaginian Senate recalled Hannibal from Italy. After 15 years of campaigning on Roman soil, he sailed home. The final confrontation came in 202 BCE at Zama. This time, Hannibal faced an enemy who had studied him, learned from him, and adopted his tactics. Scipio had cavalry superiority, better local support, and a unified command. Hannibal still had elephants. He sent them forward, but Scipio anticipated the charge, created lanes, and let the beasts pass harmlessly through. Then came the infantry clash. Then the cavalry returned, flanking Hannibal's forces, as Hannibal himself had done at Cannae. The result: Carthage was defeated. Hannibal survived, but his war was lost. Carthage signed a crushing peace. It surrendered its fleet, paid heavy tribute, and agreed never to wage war without Roman permission. Hannibal entered politics for a time, trying to reform his city, but Rome feared him, even in peace. Eventually, he fled into exile. He moved from court to court, always under Roman pressure, always hunted. And when they finally closed in, Hannibal, now an old man, took poison. His final words, as recorded by some, were bitter. "Let us relieve the Romans from the fear they have of an old man." Rome had won, but it never forgot the man who had brought it to the brink, and neither did history. Hannibal's name would echo for centuries, not just as an enemy, but as a symbol of brilliance, daring, and the limits of even the greatest ambition. He had crossed the Alps, destroyed armies, and shaken the foundations of a republic, but in the end, even he could not break it. Rome had survived Hannibal. It had stared into the abyss, suffered its worst defeats, lost tens of thousands of men, and yet it endured. After the Second Punic War, Rome stood taller than ever. It had conquered Spain, humbled Carthage, and proved that even the most brilliant commander in the world could not bring down the Republic. But victory did not bring peace. Beneath the surface, Rome had changed. Its armies were no longer just citizen soldiers defending their homes. They were professional, hardened, and often far from Italy. Its economy had shifted as wealth poured in from plunder and tribute, and its politics grew sharper, more ambitious, and more divided. The Senate ruled, but factions within it began to form. Generals returned from foreign campaigns with glory and popularity, sometimes enough to challenge the Senate itself. And in the background, always, there was Carthage. The treaty after the Second Punic War had reduced Carthage to a client state. It could not wage war, not even in self-defense, without Roman permission. Its navy was gone. Its territories in Spain were lost. But the city still stood, and it still thrived. Carthage adapted. It became a commercial center once more, trading grain, textiles, and metals. It paid its debts to Rome, rebuilt its streets, and regained some of its confidence. To many in Rome, this was acceptable. But to one man, it was intolerable. His name was Marcus Porcius Cato, known to history as Cato the Elder. A stern traditionalist, a defender of Roman austerity, and a veteran of the Second Punic War, Cato saw in Carthage not a defeated rival, but a threat waiting to rise again. He ended every speech in the Senate, no matter the topic, with the same phrase: Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. At first many laughed. Carthage posed no military danger. It followed the treaty. It kept to itself. But over time, Cato's warning began to echo louder. And then, Carthage gave Rome an excuse. North of Carthage lay the kingdom of Numidia, ruled by Massinissa, an old Roman ally from the Hannibalic War. Massinissa had ambitions of his own. He repeatedly raided Carthaginian land, knowing full well that Carthage could not respond without Rome's permission. Carthage appealed to the Senate. Rome did nothing. Finally, after years of harassment, Carthage struck back. It raised an army, without Roman approval, and fought the Numidians. It won the battle. But it broke the treaty. And Rome responded. In 149 BCE, a Roman force landed in North Africa. Officially, it came to demand guarantees. Unofficially, its purpose was clear. The Third Punic War had begun. But this was not a war between equals. Rome had grown into an empire. Carthage was a shadow of its former self. It had walls, but little else. Its navy was gone. Its mercenaries, long a source of strength, were absent. Still, it refused to surrender quietly. At first, Carthage tried to negotiate. It offered hostages. It dismantled parts of its military. It sent weapons, ships, and grain to the Romans. The Senate demanded more. It ordered the city to be abandoned, to be moved inland, away from the sea. Carthage, a city over 700 years old, was to be destroyed and rebuilt elsewhere. The people refused. They chose to fight. The final siege lasted 3 years. Rome struggled more than it expected. Carthage fortified its walls, built weapons in secret, and defended the city street by street. In 147 BCE, Rome turned to a new commander, Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, the man who had defeated Hannibal. Young, intelligent, and ruthless, Scipio approached the war with methodical precision. He tightened the siege, cut off supplies, starved the city. Then he attacked. His forces breached the outer walls, then the inner defenses, then they entered the city itself. What followed was one of the bloodiest urban battles in Roman history. For 6 days, Roman soldiers fought house to house. Carthaginian defenders built barricades from rubble, rained down oil and fire, and resisted every step. Fathers killed their own families to spare them from capture. Women threw themselves into flames. Some temples became fortresses, others became tombs. On the final day, the remaining defenders, about 50,000 civilians, took refuge in the Temple of Eshmone, high on the city's hill. Scipio offered terms. Some surrendered, others chose to burn. When it ended, Scipio walked through the ruins. The streets were silent, the walls blackened, the harbor still. The city that had once rivaled Rome for dominance over the Mediterranean was no more. Legend says that Scipio wept. His friend, the Greek historian Polybius, asked why. Scipio replied, "A day will come when fate will deal the same to Rome." He had destroyed Carthage, but he saw in its fall a mirror, a warning of what pride and empire could bring. The Senate ordered the city to be razed. Buildings were torn down, walls demolished. The ground, it said, was sown with salt, not to poison it, but as a ritual curse. Carthage ceased to exist. Its people were sold into slavery. Its lands became a Roman province, Africa. The war was over, but the story was not. For Rome, the destruction of Carthage marked a turning point. It was no longer a republic defending itself from enemies. It was now a republic that preemptively destroyed a rival, not for safety, but for dominance. Some senators celebrated. Others, like Scipio, felt unease. But Rome moved forward. It absorbed new territories in the east, fought wars in Greece and Asia, expanded into Gaul and beyond. Its legions grew in size, experience, and ambition. So did its generals. And back home, in the Senate and the Forum, old cracks deepened. Carthage was gone, but new dangers were rising, not from abroad, but from within. The Republic had defeated its greatest enemy. Now it would face its greatest test. It would have to survive itself. The fall of Carthage marked the rise of something else, something darker. For centuries, Rome had been a republic of laws, tradition, and balance. Power was divided between consuls, the Senate, and the people. No man could rule alone. No general could hold absolute sway. That was the Roman ideal. But after decades of constant war, something had shifted. Victory brought land brought wealth, and wealth brought inequality. Veterans returned from foreign campaigns to find their farms gone, sold, or ruined. Smallholders were displaced by latifundia, vast estates owned by the elite, worked by slaves captured in conquest. The backbone of the Republic, the independent Roman farmer, began to disappear. The streets of Rome filled with displaced citizens. Many had no land, no work, and no voice. Yet they were still citizens. They could still vote, and that gave them power that ambitious men could harness. One of the first to try was Tiberius Gracchus. A young patrician from a prestigious family, Tiberius had seen the problem firsthand while serving in Spain. He returned to Rome with a bold plan: redistribute public land to the poor. He was elected tribune of the plebs, a position meant to protect the rights of commoners. And in 133 BCE, he introduced a land reform bill that would limit the amount of public land any one person could hold. The Senate resisted. The rich had grown used to vast estates. They saw Tiberius not as a reformer, but as a threat to their wealth. So Tiberius bypassed the Senate. He brought his bill directly to the people. It passed. And then things escalated. Tiberius ran for a second term as tribune, something unprecedented and deeply unsettling to the Senate. Rumors spread that he wanted a crown, that he aimed to make himself king. On the day of the vote, a mob of senators and their supporters stormed the Forum. They beat Tiberius and his followers to death with wooden clubs, not swords, not official weapons, but table legs and roofing tiles. It was the first political murder in the Republic in centuries, and it would not be the last. 10 years later, Tiberius's younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, took up the cause. More eloquent, more organized, and more radical, Gaius proposed not only land reform, but subsidized grain, new colonies, and expanded citizenship for Italy's allies. He gained popularity, too much. The Senate responded again. Tensions rose, riots broke out. Gaius fled to a hill outside the city. When soldiers approached, he ordered a slave to kill him. The Gracchi were dead, but the Republic was wounded. Violence had entered politics, and it would not leave. In the decades that followed, Rome saw something new, the rise of the warlord. Generals no longer just served the state, they began to serve themselves. Two men embodied this shift, Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Marius was a novus homo, a new man, the first in his family to reach high office. He rose through sheer talent and military success. He reformed the Roman army, opening its ranks to the poor. Now, soldiers fought not for land they owned, but for land they hoped to earn from their general. Their loyalty shifted. They followed commanders, not the Senate. Sulla, an aristocrat and former subordinate of Marius, watched this carefully. Their rivalry deepened over time, political, personal, and lethal. When the Senate appointed Sulla to lead a campaign in the east, Marius maneuvered to take the command for himself. In response, Sulla did something no Roman general had ever done. He marched his army into Rome, swords drawn, shields raised, legion against citizen. He drove out his enemies and reclaimed his authority by force. It was a line Rome was never meant to cross, and now it was crossed forever. Sulla went east, fought his war, and returned years later even more powerful. Again, he marched on Rome. This time, he seized power outright. He declared himself dictator, with no term limit. He published lists of enemies, proscriptions, and offered rewards for their deaths. Heads were displayed in the forum. Property was confiscated. Blood ran in the streets. Then, having purged his rivals, rewritten the laws, and reshaped the Senate, Sulla did something no one expected. He resigned. He retired to the countryside, lived quietly, and died of illness. But the damage was done. The Republic had been broken, not in theory, but in practice. Men now knew it could be taken by force, that armies could change governments, and others were watching. Among them, a young man named Gaius Julius Caesar. He was just a boy when Sulla rose to power, but he remembered the fear, the killings, the way ambition bent the rules, and he would learn from it. Elsewhere, another figure rose, Pompey the Great, a general of immense talent and ego. He won victories in Africa, Spain, and the East. He cleared the seas of pirates. He returned to Rome at the height of his fame, and beside him stood Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, whose money had funded many campaigns. Together, Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar would form an alliance, not official, not legal, but powerful, the first triumvirate. Rome was now ruled by deals in back rooms, not votes in the Senate. The Republic still stood, but it was a shell. The next chapter would not be about laws or tradition. It would be about one man, one ambition, and one crossing of a river called the Rubicon. When Julius Caesar was born in 100 BCE, the Roman Republic had already begun to crack. He was born into an old patrician family, the Julii, but his household was not wealthy. His father died when he was young. His aunt, Julia, had been married to Gaius Marius, the great general and populist leader. That name, once a badge of honor, became dangerous when Sulla seized power. During Sulla's dictatorship, Caesar was ordered to divorce his wife, Cornelia, the daughter of a political enemy. He refused. It was a bold decision for a young man with no army, no wealth, and no allies. Sulla relented. Barely. but he is said to have remarked, "There are many Mariuses in Caesar." He was right. Caesar survived the purges, and when Sulla died, he returned to Rome and began climbing the ladder of power, the cursus honorum. He served as a military tribune, then quaestor, then aedile, dazzling the people with public games and celebrations. He borrowed heavily, often more than he could repay, but each spectacle gained him more favor. He understood something crucial. In Rome, debt could be forgiven. Fame could not be forgotten. In 63 BCE, he was elected Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, at just 37 years old. By then, the political landscape had changed again. Pompey had returned from the east, craving land for his soldiers and recognition for himself. Crassus, the banker general, remained the richest man in Rome, and Caesar, the rising star, offered the one thing they both needed: popularity with the people. Together they formed a private alliance, the first triumvirate, an agreement of mutual benefit, not law. Pompey would get land for his veterans. Crassus would secure favorable tax contracts, and Caesar would receive the consulship. In 59 BCE, Caesar became consul. He used his power to pass land reforms, protect the interests of his allies, and undermine the Senate's opposition. He also secured, for himself, the proconsulship of Gaul, a province that stretched beyond the Alps, full of wealth, danger, and opportunity. Then he left. What followed was a conquest of staggering scale. From 58 to 50 BCE, Caesar campaigned in Gaul, fighting tribes, forging alliances, and writing detailed commentaries about his victories. His Commentarii de Bello Gallico were more than records. They were propaganda, clear, persuasive, and always casting Caesar in the best light. He defeated the Helvetii, crushed the Nervii, and subdued dozens of Gallic tribes. In 52 BCE, he faced his greatest challenge, Vercingetorix, a charismatic Gallic chieftain who united the tribes against Roman domination. At the siege of Alesia, Caesar built a double line of fortifications, one facing inward toward the trapped Gauls, and one outward against a relieving army. It was an audacious gamble. It worked. Vercingetorix surrendered, and Gaul was lost to the Gauls forever. Back in Rome, his fame soared, but so did the tension. Crassus had died in the east in a disastrous campaign against the Parthians. Pompey, now jealous and uneasy, aligned himself with the Senate, and Caesar, still in Gaul, watched the alliances collapse. The Senate ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome, alone. He refused. He knew that once he stepped into the city without his imperium, without command, he would be vulnerable to charges, prosecutions, even exile. So in 49 BCE, Caesar made a choice. He crossed the Rubicon, a small river in northern Italy, a line no general was meant to cross with an army. But Caesar did, and as he did, he is said to have uttered the words, "Alia iacta est," the die is cast. Civil war began. Pompey fled to the east. Caesar pursued. He fought battles in Italy, Spain, and Greece. At Pharsalus, in 48 BCE, he defeated Pompey decisively. Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping for refuge. He found a blade. The Egyptian court, hoping to gain Caesar's favor, had him killed. When Caesar arrived and was presented with his enemy's severed head, he is said to have wept. He stayed in Egypt for some time, helping Queen Cleopatra secure her throne. Their relationship, both political and personal, would echo far beyond their time. But Caesar's work was not finished. he crushed remaining opposition in Asia Minor, declaring, Veni vidi vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. Then he returned to Rome. In 46 BCE, he was appointed dictator, first for a year, then for 10, and finally for life. He launched reforms, reorganizing debts, resettling veterans, adjusting the calendar, the Julian calendar that still shapes ours today. He extended citizenship, curbed corruption, and filled the Senate with new men, loyal to him. But with each reform, each honor, each statue and triumph, the fear grew. To some, Caesar was not restoring the Republic, he was replacing it. Whispers of kingship began to spread. Statues showed him in royal robes. A golden throne appeared in the Senate. At the Lupercalia festival, Mark Antony offered him a crown. Caesar refused, publicly, but the damage was done. To many senators, it was clear Caesar intended to rule as king, in all but name. And so, they plotted. Led by men like Brutus and Cassius, who once called Caesar a friend, they gathered in secret, convinced that by killing one man, they could save the Republic. On the Ides of March 15th, 44 BCE, Caesar entered the Senate. He was surrounded. The blades came quickly. He fought back at first, then gave in. According to legend, when he saw Brutus among the assassins, he said, Et tu, Brute, you too, Brutus. Then he fell. 23 wounds. A body on the Senate floor. The Republic, they believed, had been saved. But it had not. Instead of unity, Caesar's death unleashed chaos. Riots broke out. Factions formed. Soldiers, once loyal to Rome, now chose sides. Mark Antony seized Caesar's will and the loyalty of his veterans. But another heir had already been named. Gaius Octavius, Caesar's grandnephew, just 18 years old, was adopted posthumously and named Caesar's son. He would become Octavian. Together, Antony and Octavian defeated the assassins at Philippi. Then they turned on each other. Rome, once again, was at war with itself. And in the ashes of the Republic, something new was rising. Not a senate, not a king, but an empire. The death of Julius Caesar had not saved the Republic. Instead, it had torn Rome apart. In the days and weeks that followed, the streets of the city ran thick with fear and uncertainty. The senators who had raised their daggers in the name of liberty found themselves hunted, not hailed. The people, far from rejoicing, mourned. Caesar's body had been cremated in the Forum itself, before a crowd inflamed with grief. And into this chaos stepped two men, Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal friend, general, and co-consul, a man of charisma and cunning who claimed to carry Caesar's will in his hands, and Gaius Octavius, Caesar's young grandnephew, just 18 years old, called home from his studies in Illyria. He was slight in frame, soft in voice, and unknown to most. But he had something far more powerful than reputation. He had Caesar's name. In his will, Caesar had posthumously adopted him as son and heir. From that moment, Gaius Octavius became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, known to history as Octavian. At first, Antony underestimated the boy. So did many others. But Octavian moved carefully and decisively. He raised legions with his own money. He courted the Senate. He positioned himself not as a rival, but as a restorer, the one who would fulfill Caesar's legacy and avenge his death. In 43 BCE, in the wake of shifting loyalties and rising tensions, Octavian, Antony, and a third man, Marcus Lepidus, another of Caesar's generals, formed a second alliance, the Second Triumvirate. This time, it was not a private arrangement. It was written into law, with powers that eclipsed the Senate itself. The triumvirs wasted no time. They published prescriptions, lists of enemies marked for death. Land was seized, fortunes were taken, and one of the most painful names on those lists was Cicero, the great orator and staunch defender of the Republic. He had spoken against Antony, and for that he paid with his life. With Rome purged, the triumvirs turned east, toward those who had killed Caesar. At Philippi, in 42 BCE, the armies of Antony and Octavian met those of Brutus and Cassius. The battle was brutal. The cost was staggering. But in the end, the assassins fell. Cassius died by his own hand. Brutus followed soon after. The republic they had tried to save had died with Caesar. What remained now was a question of power and who would hold it. For a time, peace held. The spoils were divided. Antony ruled the eastern provinces. Octavian took the west. Lepidus was left with Africa, but little influence. And yet, beneath this fragile balance, fault lines were already forming. Antony, ever drawn to the east, made Alexandria his home, and Cleopatra his queen. Their bond, both personal and political, deepened. They had children together. He dressed as a Greek, worshipped like an Egyptian, and in the eyes of many Romans, forgot what it meant to be Roman at all. Meanwhile, in the west, Octavian remained in Rome, quiet, steady, methodical. He worked not with passion, but with purpose. He courted the Senate, the equestrians, the common people. He built loyalty not only with armies, but with images, portraying himself as the dutiful son, the bringer of peace, the man who stood between Rome and chaos. As Antony's presence in the east grew more distant, Octavian sharpened his message. He began to depict Antony not as a leader, but as a traitor, a man seduced by a foreign queen, a man who would divide the empire, giving Roman lands to Cleopatra's children, a man who no longer served Rome, but served Egypt. Antony, for his part, underestimated Octavian again. He sent letters, made threats, prepared ships. But in Rome, it was Octavian who controlled the narrative and the people. By 32 BCE, the alliance had shattered completely. War was declared, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. It was a brilliant move. Octavian framed the conflict not as civil war, but as a defense of Rome against a foreign queen. He summoned all of Italy to arms. Loyalty surged in his favor. And so, two vast fleets prepared for battle. One from the west, commanded by Octavian, led by his brilliant admiral Agrippa. One from the east, led by Antony and Cleopatra, their ships heavy and numerous. In September of 31 BCE, they met at Actium, a narrow bay off the western coast of Greece. The winds were light, the day was hot, the tension unbearable. The battle that followed was not decided by brute force, but by discipline, strategy, and timing. Agrippa's nimble ships outmaneuvered Antony's bulkier fleet. And then, in the midst of chaos, Cleopatra's ships turned and fled. Antony followed. His forces collapsed. What began as war ended in retreat. Octavian had won, but the story was not yet over. Far across the sea, in Alexandria, two lovers waited for the world to catch up with them, and with it, the end of an age. The waters of Actium still shimmered in memory. In Rome, the news of Octavian's victory was greeted with relief, with celebration, and with the quiet knowledge that the balance of power had shifted forever. But far away in Alexandria, the mood was different. The great harbor was crowded with ships in disrepair, their sails torn, their crews weary. Inside the royal palace, Antony and Cleopatra waited. The defeat had been devastating, but there was still a flicker of hope. Egypt was rich. Its capital was beautiful, fortified, and steeped in history. Perhaps, they thought, they could make a final stand here, together. But as the months passed, that hope began to wither. The loyalty of Antony's men faltered. Roman officers slipped away in the night, defecting to Octavian. Egyptian allies hesitated, sensing the tide was turning. Octavian, ever cautious, did not rush his attack. He moved deliberately, gathering supplies, consolidating his fleet, and letting Antony's strength drain away. By the summer of 30 BCE, his preparations were complete. Octavian's legions landed on the Egyptian coast. From the west, his forces advanced across the desert. From the east, his ships sailed into the Nile Delta. Alexandria, the shining jewel of the Ptolemies, found itself surrounded. The siege began quietly. Octavian's forces cut off supplies, closing the city's harbors. Each day, more of Antony's soldiers slipped away to the enemy. The city's once proud defenders now looked to their leaders, and saw not salvation, but the shadow of defeat. In the palace, Antony tried to keep his dignity. He trained with his soldiers, patrolled the walls, gave rousing speeches. But in private, he knew the truth. He had fought for Rome. He had loved Rome. And now, Rome was at his gates, led by a man who had once called him ally. Then came the day when the end could no longer be denied. Reports reached Antony that his fleet had surrendered without a fight, that his cavalry had gone over to Octavian. And then, a final blow. Word came to him, false as it turned out, that Cleopatra was dead. Struck with grief, Antony fell on his sword. The wound was deep, but not fatal. His attendants, in panic, carried him to Cleopatra's chambers. There, bleeding and fading, he saw her alive, and the cruel mistake was clear. In their final moments together, they spoke not of politics, but of love, of the years they had shared, and of the fate that had brought them here. Antony asked to be remembered as a Roman, and then, in her arms, he died. Cleopatra was now alone. She was still the queen of Egypt, but only in name. Octavian entered Alexandria without resistance. He met Cleopatra, spoke with her, and assured her she would be treated with honor. But she knew what Roman honor often meant. She would not be paraded in chains through the streets of Rome, a trophy for Octavian's triumph. In the late summer of 30 BCE, Cleopatra prepared for her own death. The details are lost to time, wrapped in rumor and legend. Some say she allowed a venomous asp to bite her. Others claim she used a fast-acting poison hidden in a comb or ointment. However it happened, when her servants found her, she was lying peacefully, dressed in her finest robes, a diadem on her brow. Beside her lay 2 of her most loyal attendants, already dead. With Cleopatra's death, 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule came to an end. Egypt was annexed as a Roman province. Its vast grain supply would feed the people of Rome. Its treasures filled Octavian's coffers, making him the richest man in the known world. But wealth alone was not the prize. Octavian now stood as the sole master of Rome. No rival armies remained. No Senate faction could challenge him. For the first time in a generation, the Roman world was at peace, though it was a peace born not of the Republic, but of one man's dominance. In 29 BCE, Octavian returned to Rome in triumph. The streets were filled with cheering crowds. Temples rang with prayers of thanksgiving. Statues of the young victor were raised in the forum, in the temples, and in the provinces. He presented himself not as a king, the Romans still recoiled from that word, but as the princeps, the first citizen, a man who held extraordinary powers, yet claimed to serve the Senate and people of Rome. It was a careful balance, one that hid the truth. The Republic was gone. The offices, the elections, the Senate still existed, but real power belonged to Octavian. In 27 BCE, the Senate awarded him a new name, one that would echo through the ages, Augustus, and so began the Roman Empire. The decades of civil war were over. In their place came a new order, with Augustus at its head. He would rule for more than 40 years, expanding Rome's borders, reforming its laws, and shaping its destiny. Under him, the empire would enter a period of relative peace, the Pax Romana, that would last for generations. Yet peace, like power, came at a cost. The ideals of the old republic, the checks and balances, the shared governance, had been swept aside. In their place stood an empire, built on the will of one man. Some saw this as salvation, others as the final betrayal of everything Rome had once claimed to be. But history, like the Tiber, flows ever onward. The Republic was a memory. The Empire had begun. And this is where our story of the Roman Republic ends. But it is not the end of Rome's story. Far from it. Ahead lie centuries of conquest and culture, of emperors both wise and cruel, of triumphs that touched the edges of the known world, and tragedies that shook it to its core. We will see the empire at its height, glittering with marble and gold, and we will watch as it begins its long, slow decline. If you have followed this journey from the streets of the early Republic to the halls of Augustus's palace, I thank you. The rise and fall of the Roman Republic is one of history's most enduring tales, a reminder that even the mightiest institutions are fragile, and that the course of history can turn on the choices of a few. If you would like to continue into the next chapter, the story of the Roman Empire, make sure you're subscribed and turn on notifications so you won't miss the first episode. Like, share, and comment to let us know what you've enjoyed most about this series. For now, close your eyes, let the echoes of the forum fade, and rest in the knowledge that you have walked through one of the greatest stories ever told. The Republic is over. The Empire awaits.